Richard Weller is the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. It's a pleasure to introduce Richard.
Thank you, Fritz. That was very nice. Unfortunately, there's nothing funny in my presentation today. It's probably a little bit heavy for the way things have been going this morning. But I was doing quite a lot of writing for the book that will follow this conference, so I thought I would read this out to you. It's a work in progress, but I don't normally read things out. I find it too formal, it's too stultifying. But nonetheless, I'm going to do it today, and in the interest of time, I'll try and get you out of here in 40 minutes or 45 so we can have lunch. The title of the conference is sort of a provocation for me because it sets up immediately a dialectic between nature and cities. It reinforces the dualism that has characterised the entire history of the city. I will argue, as no doubt many others will and already have, that it's no longer tenable to think of the city and nature. It's now appropriate and more productive to think of the city as nature. Simply, the expression city as nature situates the city as coextensive with its environment. Now, it is along these now global lines that design intelligence has to be applied if we are to reduce the calamity of the ecological crisis. By calamity, I mean grossly inefficient and destructive systems, and the loss of biodiversity, and ultimately the loss of humanity. The loss of humanity both as a noun and an adjective. But to say the city as nature implies that we know what nature is. And truth be told, we do not. And I've always been very circumspect about landscape architecture's enthusiasm for nature. Nature is the most fraught and ideologically licentious term in the English language. And as such, every time we hear it, we should ask immediately, well, which nature exactly and whose nature exactly? Apart from Picard and one or two others, landscape architects have not thought long enough or critically enough about the nature they claim to represent and stand so firmly upon. Nature is typically reduced to a victim or a redeemer. The etymology of the word means to be born, but let's not forget, as Fritz has reminded us, that nature also kills you. Although it is important to now try and design things which go with the greater flow, it is also important to remember that the existence of most living things take their form by resisting the flow. Nature is both flow and not flow, and life appears to be something wedged fleetingly in between. In this regard, despite also being an incubator of disease, the city has been a brilliant incubator of life, a machine designed to abate death and resist the entropic flows that universally govern it. But the city is also fundamentally flawed. The city as we know it, since its inception, has been, I think, fundamentally flawed. Instead of fitting, as Picard would have it, the city has only flourished through continual expansion into new land. Having now reached a global endpoint, the city is now effectively thwarted its host. And this is not unnatural per se. On the contrary, as they flourish, species typically create the conditions of their own demise. In our case, this is called climate change. The difference, of course, is that no other species has ever become self-aware of this predicament, nor has any other species been equipped with global communications and monitoring systems to provide it with the feedback about its situation. Paradoxically then, to avoid the natural tendency to self-destruct, you could say that we now need to become unnatural. Although it appears to play the role of the innocent bystander, landscape architecture is entirely complicit in this evolutionary development of the city. Although much landscape architecture remains aesthetically tied to the paradisical and the naturalistic, landscape architecture is, I think, no longer representing the nature that culture has lost, but rather the nature it now must construct. Like music is to music, it's not the real thing, but it will have to do. Fully committed to the city, we can say that landscape architecture is now a utopian project. And this is an important historical and philosophical point, because to enter utopia, by definition, you have to leave the garden. Although better than paradise, which is literally mindlessness, because it is about politics and invention, utopia is an improvement. However, like paradise, utopia tends towards stasis, not to mention fascism. So I don't mean that landscape architecture should now naively enlist in the repressive utopian project of the city, but rather that we bring something critical to it. This concerns linking the politics and inventiveness of the city with ecological flows and opening the city to a new level of evolution. And I think this, broadly speaking, is what we have been meaning by the term landscape urbanism. This is also why in his latest book, Landscape Urbanism and Its Discontents, Andres Duany, the spiritual leader of the Congress for the New Urbanism, tells us to literally get out of town. I'll come back to Duany and the contest over who has the keys to the city a little bit later, but to get there I want to take a historical detour. The reason for this historical detour is that I think we need to be reminded that nature is historically contingent and ideological. I also want to try and build up the idea that the city as nature, or if you like, the ecological city, is without precedent, and therefore can only be a project of radical invention, or as Jim Corner would say, imagination. In my written paper, I offer a deeper history of the city and nature, but in the interest of time, let's cut straight to modernity, the signature of which is, of course, the grid. Where Renaissance and Baroque gardens reached for and ultimately demystified the horizon, it was urbanisation through the agency of the grid that would fill in the middle ground. Originating with Hippodamus's ideal city of Miletus, the birthplace of Western science, a grid organisation of space would, in the 16th century, effectively take the world. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator enwrapped the globe with longitude and latitude, and 3 years later, the same logic enshrined in the law of the Indies would dictate the morphology of Spanish new towns in the Americas. Indeed, the grid became the preferred system of colonisation the world over, and it was flung across the United States and elsewhere as the meshwork of enlightenment at the close of the 18th century. Nothing would escape its logic. The X and Y axes of the grid also provided the armatures of René Descartes' eponymous system of calculus, and it was upon this and Galileo's mechanics that Newton would construct his universe. An infinite void of absolute space and time, Newton's nature was one in which any moving object could be accurately described and its future predicted with the equation force equals mass times acceleration. F equals ma became the crowning intellectual achievement of the scientific revolution, as the poet Alexander Pope wrote upon the occasion of Newton's death, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night, and God said, let Newton be, and all was light." The radical conclusion, and this is interesting, to be drawn from Newton's 3 universal laws of motion was that heaven and earth may not be that different after all. Newton effectively linked the rationality of the human mind to that of the Creator and stitched the mechanics of our bodies into the very fabric of the universe. In other words, Newton, mathematically at least, repaired everything that had been rent asunder at the fall. The problem was, however, that this universe of which we were now evidently a part was now terrifying in its infinitude. God was not dead, and Newton certainly hung on to him, but God was not where we'd always thought he was. Whilst the scientific and political revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries placed great faith in nature as a model of order, that nature was simultaneously reduced to a machine. For Descartes, animals were mere automata, and for Newton, God a watchmaker. These most dangerous of metaphors, and metaphors are always dangerous, were translated by more practical men into the actual machines that fired the Industrial Revolution across Europe and into the New World, and with it, the veritable inferno of ecological exploitation that continues naturally and apace to this day. Driven by the Industrial Revolution, the trilogy of Christianity, capitalism and reason, known otherwise as colonialism, fanned out across the globe with disastrous consequences for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous landscapes. Monocultures replaced biodiversity, and monotheism replaced genius loci. The people in the image here are Australian Aborigines. At first they were framed as noble savages. Later they were treated as animals and cast outside the economy of salvation. These people have no word for nature, and they never built cities. Appalled by the violence of the Industrial Revolution, aristocrats and artists in both the old world and the new retreated into the landscape's more picturesque clefts and dreamt of Arcadia, much as they do today. The romanticisation of landscape as modernity's other gave us the poetry of Wordsworth, the English garden, and later Thoreau, Muir and national parks, but so too it reduced landscape to scenery. Landscape becomes the industrial city's innocent counterpart, and in the hands of the emerging discipline of landscape architecture, it's veiled. Where landscape entered cities by design, it did so as pastoral parkland, a domesticated nature, a toothless tiger from which to draw both spiritual and physical refreshment, while the real landscape beyond the city was treated as a resource and reorganised as an extension of emerging global production lines. Different though they are in context, both Yosemite and Central Park enshrine the same culture-nature, city-landscape dialectic. Neither tells the truth, but both are beautiful fictions. Confusion over what nature was, and therefore what culture should and should not be, was, and to an extent still is, tensioned between John Locke's belief in a fundamentally benign nature and Thomas Hobbes's alternative conclusion that the natural state of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. This polarisation was later exacerbated by the various ways in which Charles Darwin's explanation of natural selection was interpolated into the socio-political arena. We've heard about Darwin previously. Although Darwin could explain evolution's mechanics, what was really interesting about Darwin was that he refused to give it purpose and direction. And so it was into this existential void that sexist, racist and speciesist assertions of hierarchy and rights quickly moved. Darwin showed that humanity was made by and subject to the same forces as all living things. So just as Newton had conjoined culture to the cosmos, Darwin now rooted it in the earth. For science at least, there was no longer any nature-culture divide. But for society at large, as any trip to the zoo would quickly confirm, nature and culture were on entirely different sides of the fence. Despite Darwin's conclusion to his masterpiece on the origin of species that there is grandeur in the evolutionary view of life, the deep fear of evolutionary theory was and is because it describes a world that appears random and is quite possibly meaningless. Darwin does, however, leave us with the seeds of an ecological sensibility when he writes that the disinterested love for all living creatures is the most noble attribute of man. That's about as far as Darwin goes into morality, ethics and values. This noble attribute would inspire the burgeoning natural sciences of the 19th century, culminating in what Paul Sears would refer to in the 20th and I love this expression, the subversive science of ecology. Writing in 1964, Sears explained that ecology mounted a powerful threat to established assumptions in society and in economics, religion and the humanities, as well as the other sciences and their ways of doing business. The strengths and weaknesses of this subversive science is, as Darwin had indicated, precisely that it is such a complicated interweaving of both love and science. But, strictly speaking, there is nothing in the science which contradicts humanity's relentless exploitation of the natural world. The metaphysical void of modern cosmology and anxiety as to the purpose of consciousness in evolution was largely absolved by the sheer busyness of industrial progress, from Sir Francis Bacon's insistence that all nature be interrogated in order to build a utopia of knowledge, to the economist Adam Smith's theory that through wealth creation we could reconstruct paradise. The central tenet of modern humanism was that we could now make the world on our terms. The various utopian and early 20th century cities that were conceived to mitigate the chaos of rapid growth and secure healthy and affordable mass housing in an industrial age were also overtly concerned with some form of reconciliation between the city and nature. That is, nature as landscape. For example, the generous green belts and transit-oriented villages of Ebenezer Howard's agrarian socialism was about as close to integration with nature as landscape as the city had ever come in its history. Howard's relatively compact villages, about 3 or 4 times the density of conventional suburbia, however, they could not hold their ground against the exponential growth of both people and cars, which when put together formed the vast tracts of suburbia, now known pejoratively as sprawl. Seen from the air, suburbia is, for its critics, a malignancy, and it stands accused of producing the highest ecological footprint and carbon emissions ever known. For its apologists, this city of choice for a majority of the developed world's citizens, replete with private gardens and bucolic open spaces, is a relatively innocuous interweaving of natural and cultural systems, a happy hybrid. Both these opinions contain aspects of the truth, and an either-or debate is pointless. The important question now is whether suburbia can be ecologically retrofitted to endure a transition beyond fossil fuels. What suburbia achieved horizontally, Le Corbusier, with his radiant city, tried but failed to achieve vertically. Approximately 100 times the density of typical suburbia, Corbusier's city for 3 million was a machine lifted into the air on pilotis so that primordial nature could serve as its psychological counterpart on the ground plane below. As it happened, this primordial nature became vast swathes of useless grass and trees surrounding car parks. Although in bastardised form, the general formula of towers in the park remains efficient at providing affordable housing and continues to be applied in the developing world to absorb what is now the largest rural emigration in history. As with suburbia, we need to creatively reimagine this model on its own logistical terms, in particular its ground plan, if we are to seriously improve its environmental and social performance. While Howard and Corbusier worried how the city would relate to nature as landscape, Albert Einstein wondered what nature really was by asking what the world would look like at the speed of light. As it happens, objects lose their colour and their shadows, something Cubism would later illustrate. But more strange is that as you approach that terminal velocity, Euclidean space, the three-dimensional space by which we predominantly construct our reality, folds in upon itself, like a sheet in the wind. Most famously, Einstein described objects as embodied energy. For example, an average human being contains subatomic energy, the equivalent of 30 large hydrogen bombs. His theorems also showed that every object is uniquely shaped by space and in turn shapes that space. Each object has its own unique space and time. Einsteinian space is not empty. It is not an absolute backdrop against which events simply occur, and nor is it a mysterious ether that holds the planets in their orbits. Although invisible to the eye, Einsteinian space is full. It's full of electromagnetism and full of gravity, forces which are in turn byproducts of the objects they envelop. Just as Newton and Darwin had done before him, Einstein's description of reality was one which profoundly integrated humanity, and for that matter all objects, with space, time and energy flow. So it's effectively an ecological worldview, albeit from a physicist. The problem was, however, that everything Einstein explained by way of that integration was A, invisible, and B, incomprehensible. As such, because we habitually perceive a landscape of objects disconnected from one another in a Euclidean void, the essential architecture of the nature-culture divide endures, despite all evidence to the contrary. Whilst Einstein had built his theories on light, its fundamental subatomic properties, evaded scientific determination in conventional, that is, Newtonian terms. That is, at the subatomic level, particles could not be measured without the act of measurement itself affecting the result. Treated as a wave, light is a wave. Treated as a particle, light is a particle. Furthermore, because a given particle's next move can't be accurately predicted, the possibility that nature was, at its core, indeterminate became both a scientific and a cultural reality in the 20th century. Indeterminacy resonated throughout the 20th century, from Duchamp's four-dimensional work through to Pollock's paintings, Cage's music and Smithson's sculpture. All these explored aspects of chance through entropic pathways which led to the new nature of chaos theory. Similarly, the quantum fact that the observer affected the result of the observation destabilised the authority of science as the arbiter of objective truth, and encouraged postmodern culture's general inclination to emphasise the subjectivity and context-dependent partiality of knowledge. As a broad cultural shift, postmodernism thus favoured the particularities of place over universal modernist notions of space. And it was this emphasis on geographic, biological and ethnographic specificity that became 20th century landscape architecture's theoretical and practical basis. It would, however, not be until the 21st century that landscape architecture would finally free itself from the predominance of spatial composition, or frozen muzak, and begin to engage the fourth dimension of time and its inherently indeterminate qualities as its primary agent. Along with the Holocaust, the lethal detonation of atomic bombs in 1945 was the critical terminus between modern and postmodern culture. The epitaph to the modern project of humans becoming gods was aptly provided by the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer when, on the occasion of testing nuclear weaponry that he had helped design, he concluded, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." That he quoted the Bhagavad Gita and not the Gospel of St. John could be taken as a symbolic turning point for Western scientific reason. Committing a form of scientific heresy, Fritjof Capra's 1975 book, The Tao of Physics, captured the zeitgeist by articulating the poetic connections between quantum physics and Eastern mysticism. In Buddhism and Hinduism, the West found a non-linear universe, one still full of the spirit it had otherwise drained from the world ever since the Greek Enlightenment of the 6th century BC. Capra's belief in the interconnectedness of all things, which he referred to as holism, manifested an emerging ecological paradigm shift in the sciences, the humanities and popular culture at large. Transcending both a capitalist cornucopia and a communist utopia, both of which had proven environmentally ruinous, the big idea that came to unify and shape global culture in the late 20th century, and will surely continue to do so into the 21st, was that of the ecological interconnectivity of all things, and the global limitations to linear models of growth. Buckminster Fuller's Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, 1968, followed by the Club of Rome's 72 report on limits to growth, made the seemingly obvious point that the Earth is finite and modern ideas of progress were not. Also, for the first time in urban history, utopias such as Aldous Huxley's Island, 1962, and Ernst Kallenbach's Ecotopia in 75 suggested reconciliation not only between the urban and the rural, but between culture and nature and spirit and matter more broadly. These utopias also exhibited a deep nostalgia for animism, a return to nature, that intersected with ecofeminist interests in pre-urban matriarchy and long since repressed conceptions of a feminine earth deity. The Newtonian mechanics, which gave accuracy to weaponry, also put man on the moon with a camera in his hand, and it was from that distant vantage point that ecofeminism and the environmental movement would find their ultimate icon. What Newton, Darwin and Einstein had described with their various theories of the precise interconnectivity between humanity and its environment was now popularly comprehensible in one image. For the first time in history, instead of looking up, humans looked back down upon themselves and saw their terrestrial environment and themselves as one. It followed then that what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. Accordingly, what scientists such as James Lovelock and planners such as Ian McCart, among many others, pointed out was that we were slowly but surely killing ourselves and much more besides. Lovelock argues that the planet's self-regulatory systems, which wax and wane between ice ages, are perfectly suited to the production and sustainment of diverse life forms, are now jeopardised by carbon levels of over 400 parts per million. Not to put too fine a point on it, Lovelock predicts that because of irreversible climate change, the Earth will, in all likelihood, and I quote, become like her dead sibling, Venus. In other words, humans will eliminate life on Earth, not with their atomic bombs, but just by driving their kids to school, just by being normal. Indeed, if everyone on Earth lived what we in the first world consider normal, the ecological footprint of civilization would require an Earth this big to sustain it. The current Earth is indicated with the white dashed line. After reviewing a range of geoengineering solutions to reduce global warming, such as altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere through the jet stream, cultivating algal blooms in the ocean, and launching orbiting shade structures, Lovelock recommends that we simply lock up all remaining habitat and construct new ecosystems to sequester carbon. It is not enough, however, to just plant trees as in plantations, as these landscapes have little long-term resilience. Lovelock says we need to reconstruct ecosystems which have complexity. Reminiscent of Ian McCart, Lovelock refers to people who may do this work as planetary doctors. But in all his writings, not once does he mention landscape architects. Currently, the only formal mechanism for achieving the global protection and restoration of large-scale habitat lies with the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. Under that convention, 193 nations have agreed to restore habitat to reach a global total of 17%. And that should be achieved by 2020. The United States and Somalia are not part of this convention. But according to the convention, this 17% cannot just be anywhere. You can't just put it in Siberia and say we're done. The convention stipulates that the 17% must be representative of the world's 857 ecoregions. Not only must it be representative of the different ecoregions, this restorative project on a global scale must also be interconnected. That is, you need large land ecological networks to be completely reconstructed. to pick up existing fragments of habitat and weave into a whole system, the new sites. Insofar as I can tell, of the 193 nations party to the convention, only 12 have anything remotely resembling a spatial plan. Although there is a strong body of work regarding the planning and designing of greenways in landscape architecture, this work has difficulty being translated into real conditions on the ground and is not getting out to the places where it is needed most. Given that 13% of the world's terrestrial area is presently under some form of protection, that's light green on this image, an additional 4% seems kind of modest. 4%, however, is 6 million kilometres squared. The 4% target, the 4% increase that we need to meet the targets, must also be seen against the rate of ongoing habitat loss, which a recent report in the journal Science estimated at 1.5 million square kilometres, or 439,882 central parks. That was between 2000 and 2012. So when you put all this together, the amount of land that needs to be restored and legally protected and interconnected into larger landscape networks equals well over 2 million central parks. Although achieving this would seem unlikely, where economies are emerging from poverty and urbanising, as is the case, for example, in China now, so too their forests are tending to make a comeback. Global urbanisation is also ecologically beneficial because life in cities tends to lead to reduced birth rates. Demographers predict a global population of circa 10 billion people by century's end. For the first time in urban history, then it is expected that population will stabilise and even begin to fall. So that's a historically unprecedented moment. The challenge for us then is to get to that point with some semblance of a global ecosystem that is conducive to life as we know it. Although they may well agree with Lovelock's essential hypothesis that the Earth is a meta-organism to which we are secondary, academic ecofeminists balk at the return of a gendered Earth, popularised by his Gaia hypothesis. Scholars such as Donna Haraway criticise the biological conflation of women and nature, arguing that the ideal of a return to organic wholeness, even if possible, was reactionary. Haraway put it most succinctly when she wrote, "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess." Her invocation of the cyborg shifted the politics of ecology and identity from the pre-urban and pre-lapsarian to the very frontier of contemporary science. Although 9/11 took all the attention, the 21st century opened with the scripting of the human genome, and it will be in the form of new splicings of technology and organisms that the nature of the 21st century will be determined. The question Haraway and artists such as Patricia Piccinini, shown here, rightly ask is, who is designing this new nature and for exactly what purposes? Landscape architecture, particularly as it becomes more involved in the bioengineering of novel ecosystems, should probably ask the same question. In the late 20th century, a spate of books such as Kate Sober's What is Nature, Alexander Wilson's The Culture of Nature, Carolyn Merchant's The Death of Nature, and Bill McKibben's The End of Nature began to account for this new nature. And the question they all posed was not how to return to a pure nature, but how to now manage the impure. McCarg, of course, called this stewardship, and the word occurs to this day repeatedly in almost every charter of landscape architecture around the world. Lovelock has said that he would rather expect a goat to become a gardener than humans to become stewards of the earth. He says he couldn't possibly think of a worse fate than to be charged with managing the earth's ecosystems. Be that as it may, it seems we now have no choice. In this regard, McCarg, despite contradictions in his philosophy and limits to his method, becomes more, not less important as time goes on. In 2011, at the American Society of Landscape Architects annual meeting in San Diego, Andres Duaney, who I mentioned at the outset, said that the problem with McHarg's method is that it stops where the green ends. It does not make a proposition for the human habitat. He went on to accuse McHargian planning, as now manifested in environmental protection standards, of aiding and abetting sprawl, which of course is evil incarnate. In other words, by designing with landscape as nature, we cannot, according to Duaney, arrive at beautiful, that is traditional urban form of sufficient density to function efficiently. But Duaney, for polemical purposes, is conflating the scale of urban design with the scale of landscape planning and accusing the two of being at cross purposes, when in actual fact they can nest within one another. Where regional landscape systems and the grain of urban design align awkwardly is precisely where novel design solutions can be sought. In some cases, the city should yield to landscape systems. In others, the city can resist the landscape. And sometimes they can merge to form new hybrids. These things have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. More recently, Duaney has consolidated his defence of urbanism against landscape by asserting that Manhattan's brilliance is precisely because its plan has more or less entirely ignored the landscape of the place. He argues that today's landscape urbanists would not create such a city because instead of applying a mechanistic stormwater solution and the grid, as per the 1811 Commissioner's plan, they would be befuddled by attempting to daylight the site's original 3,000 streams and wetlands. But Duaney exaggerates Manhattan's virtues and he underestimates landscape architecture's potential contribution to the city. So what would a Manhattan be like now if a landscape urbanist approach was taken? Firstly, a McHargian analysis would be effective in creating a regional framework for the city. Such an analysis may well have reached the conclusion that a dense city should be located where we find it today. But such an analysis would almost certainly have precluded development on all the low-lying lands of high ecological value, and lands which, as McHarg forewarned and as we've seen, are now threatened by sea level rise and storm surge. At an urban design scale, however, Duaney has a point. A slavish and puritanical application of McHargian planning may not give rise to a great city. But landscape architects have long known the design limitations of McHargian analysis, and it is largely out of this that landscape urbanism has emerged. Whereas for McHarg, the city designed without nature was God's junkyard, an aberration in the natural order of things, landscape urbanism embraced the granite garden, appraising it as a dynamic social and ecological system somewhat beyond good and evil. Whereas the ecology that McHarg based his future city on was a system approaching equilibrium that humans could only negatively disrupt, the ecology of landscape urbanism is inclusive, chaotic, indeterminate and emergent. As Rod Barnett explains in his recent book Emergence in Landscape Architecture, he says, since neither nature nor cities are in a state of equilibrium, both natural and social structures emerge and converge in a complex process that involves changes from one state to another. Very open-ended. He goes on to say, now that cities are being understood as open, non-linear systems enriched like ecosystems by disturbance and dependent upon feedback loops to achieve greater levels of complexity and resilience, landscape architects working in the urban realm are harnessing the metaphors of flow and self-organisation to develop new kinds of solutions to growing urban problems. So, with this in mind, the landscape urbanist designing Manhattan might well look to the site's hydrological and topography as a basis for urban form. This could be abstracted into a different plat for the city, in turn generating new building typologies, new street sections, and instead of Central Park, which after all is just a picturesque behemoth, Instead of Central Park, a distributed and highly integrated network of smaller high-performance green spaces will be part of the solution. I'm just about to finish. I think Andrew Brogan stole some of my time. Of course, Central Park is iconic and successful, but Manhattan is not a model 21st century city just because it isn't sprawl. In asserting it as such, and as is the case with all the traditional urbanism he generally endorses, Duane runs the really serious risk of arresting the evolution of urbanism somewhere in the 19th century. This at a time when the mechanistic nature of cities, conceived upon the historical distinction between nature and culture, now threatens global biodiversity, is profoundly problematic. When Duane sees Manhattan, he sees streets and blocks, figure and ground. When landscape urbanists see Manhattan, they now try to see a four-dimensional ecology of material and cultural flows over extended geographies. The Manhattan of the future, the model city of the future, has to be designed with this relational geography in mind, not just the street grid. If we limit sustainability to lead-rated buildings and walkability, then it is not hard to repurpose new urbanism as sustainable urbanism, as is now being undertaken. But if we appraise the city in all its systemic global complexity, as we must if we are to understand it ecologically, then the prospect of what is meant by landscape, green or ecological urbanism cannot be found in historical precedent. The privileging of temporal flow over fixed form in both chaos theory and ecology encourages more metabolic and less morphological conceptions of the city. Although it may well be promulgated by a base interest in economic efficiencies, the pathways to a deeper understanding of the city, something slightly wrong, and a redesign of the city as coextensive with, rather than antithetical to the flows of the broader ecosystem, lie in a metabolic conception and mapping of the city. It is stultifying and dangerous to continue to see the city set against nature's backdrop, or as something that can be reductively categorised into exclusive types along a new urbanist transect that still has nature fixed at one end and culture at the other. The city is now everywhere, and the world is a hybridised, denatured, co-evolving ecology of our own making. The global city, spread across vast landscapes of resource extraction and waste, is the new nature. And this new nature is suicidal unless we can transition cities from their basis in 19th century engineering and move them towards 21st century understandings of ecology. For better or worse, the design of the city has always reflected larger ideas of natural order and humanity's role in relation to that order. So too, this history teaches that nature is always already an historically contingent construct and now is no different. This knowledge should temper our appropriation of nature in ideological or absolutist terms and question the reduction of the city to cosmological or biological metaphors. But so too, it should inspire us now, for the first time in urban history, to try and conceive, design and build a city that creates more than it destroys. For that to happen, we need to think of the city as nature.